Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and today I'm going to be starting a series on double action, single action autoloaders. The reason why I'm doing this is because there is a person that follows me on social media who requested further information about that platform in general. And pretty much all except for one of my handguns is of that type. And so I figured that I would at least share what I know. I don't know everything, and there's certainly other people out there that know far more than me, but I figured I would know at least some things that would be helpful. And one of the things that is most helpful is, having been someone who at one point was new to guns, now having a decent amount of experience, not great, but a decent amount of experience, kind of share the journey and some of the thought processes behind it. And so that's what I'm going to do with this series. I'm going to be sharing kind of my own personal experience with these guns and talk about a lot of different issues and areas of concern. This first video is going to cover what one is and also why you might prefer it versus other platforms in general. In future videos, we'll be talking about things like maintenance. We'll be talking about things like grip. We'll be talking about trigger pull. We'll be talking about sights and sight alignment, caliber, bullet choice, bullet selection. We'll be covering a lot of different areas, a lot of different ground. And for those of you guys out there who are relatively experienced shooters, a lot of this is not going to be terribly new. Not at all. And it's not really meant for more experienced shooters, although I'm going to throw a few tidbits in here and there that you might find helpful, and at least some of the thought processes of why you might want this versus that you'll still find generally useful. But at the end of the day, this series is geared towards people who are relatively new to firearms. And because of that, I'm doing it as a series and not one giant long video. A giant long video, we could cover all of the material necessary, but it'd be a little overwhelming if we did it all at once. So what we're going to do is we're just going to break it down into one or two main topics per video and just kind of leave it at that. Alright, so now you know what we're getting into, you know what the goal is. Let's get into our first couple of topics. Our first couple of topics is, what is a double action, single action autoloader? And then we're going to follow that up with a question of, why might you want one of those versus some other kind of gun? So to help answer the first question, what is it? I'm going to use this TPR9C, Versa TPR9C, as an example of the type. And a lot of the future videos, I'll also probably be using this gun as my example. It's one of the guns that I have travel with me a lot of times, and so I usually have it around, and it's convenient to do videos with because of that. But just as a matter of safety and demonstrating good firearm safety for people, we're going to go ahead and check and make sure that the gun is clear. I'm going to cover more of this in another video that's actually on the topic of safety, and also when we talk about the controls on the gun. But for right now, the main thing that you need to know is that in order to unload a gun like this, you need to make sure that the magazine is out first, and then check to make sure that the chamber is clear. So 2 steps. Remove the magazine, check the chamber. Now on this one, I can visually see and also feel that there is nothing inside of the grip at all. That's usually where the magazine sits. So the magazine has already been taken out of this gun. So our first step is already done for us. That's nice. But we still need to check the chamber. And the way that you do that is you need to open up the gun. Exactly how we do that, I'll cover in a video when we talk about the controls. But the main idea is that you're going to take the slide on the top here and you're going to lock it back. There's a little button that they'll have on the side that you can use to lock them back. And once it is locked back, you'll be able to see into the back of the barrel, and that's what's called the chamber. That's the place that actually holds the bullet so that it can be fired. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to look down in there, and I'm going to look for a bullet, and I can see no bullet. So that's good. Now to be doubly sure, just to be on the safe side, I'm going to head and take my pinky finger and I'm going to put it in there and make sure that I can't feel anything in there either. It should just be a hole on the back of the barrel. That's all that I should feel, is just a little hole. Shouldn't feel anything else, it should just be a hole. And that's all that I feel. It's just the back of the barrel, it's just a hole in the back of the barrel. That's exactly what I want it to be. So this gun is empty. We first checked to make sure that there was no magazine in it, and you can see straight through the gun when it's open. There's obviously no magazine in it. And we can see inside there are no bullets. I felt inside, there are no bullets. This gun is clear, which means it is safe to handle. And that brings us into answering the question of what is a double action, single action autoloader. Let's take a look at the autoloader part first. We said that the magazine fits inside the grip here, and the bullets are going to rest horizontally inside the grip, and they're going to be under spring tension being pushed up. Now when the gun is closed like this, they're going to be pushed up against the bottom of the slide and they're not going to be able to move. But when a round is fired, the gun will cycle back, and then those bullets that are being pushed up will actually be able to come the rest of the way up. Now they're not going to pop out because the magazine has little lips on it that will keep them from doing that. But they'll be able to pop up enough that the slide, when it comes forward, will be able to push on the back of them and shove them into the chamber. That's what an autoloader is. It automatically loads the next round into the chamber for you. So you pull the trigger, the gun goes off, the slide comes back, it picks up the next round and pushes it into the chamber for you, so that the next time you pull the trigger, it's already ready to go. That's an autoloader. It automatically loads the gun for you. Another appropriate term for them is semi-auto. A full auto would be a gun where you pull the trigger once and it keeps firing and keeps firing and keeps firing until you let the trigger go. And semi-auto, on the other hand, like this gun, will only load one round into the chamber for you, and it will not fire it for you. You have to fire each round yourself. You have to pull the trigger each time you want the gun to go off. Okay, that's usually what is available to civilians, at least easily, and it's a very practical system. It allows you to aim before you take the next shot. And it helps you conserve ammo as well, which is a good thing. Alright, so that's the autoloader part. It automatically loads for you. Semi-auto meaning that it doesn't keep firing. It just stops at the point of loading the next round for you. It will not fire the next round for you. But then we need to talk about the other part. What is the whole double action, single action part of the description? Well, that refers to what is going on with the hammer relative to the trigger. Most of the time with these kinds of guns, once the action cycles and it comes back, it's going to take the hammer and it's going to push it down like this one is. This one has the hammer down, and that means that in order to get the gun to fire, the hammer is going to have to come up, and it will strike the back of the gun. You can see a little dimple in there. See how much light we can get in there. You see a little dimple right in there, and that is the back of the firing pin, and the hammer has to come up and hit that in order for the gun to go off. And so normally all that happens when you pull the trigger is that hammer comes forward. Okay, that's usually all that happens. The action will cycle, it'll force the hammer down because the slide comes back and it forces it down, and then in order to get the gun to go off, you pull the trigger and the hammer goes through one action, just coming up. So that's single action. Now these guns are capable of firing even when the hammer is all the way forward. Not all guns, historically especially, are like that. For example, the old revolvers were such that you actually had to physically thumb the hammer down each time you wanted to fire the gun. On these kinds of guns, though, I can fire the gun with the hammer down, like I just showed you, or even when the hammer is up, I can still fire the gun. But the trigger is going to do something different this time. Last time, the trigger just released the hammer to fly forward. This time, when I pull the trigger, it's going to have to bring the hammer back, one action, and then release it, the other action. So it's going to be double action, down and then up. So I pull the trigger, hammer comes back, releases it, it comes up. So that's a double action trigger pull. So these kinds of semi-autos are capable of both kinds of trigger pulls. Single action trigger pull, which is usually fairly light and crisp because all you're doing is releasing the hammer. You're not actually fighting the hammer spring down, you're just releasing it. So it's usually fairly light and crisp. And then, so that was the single action pull. And then if the hammer is up, you can still fire the gun. You're just going to have to fight the hammer spring, and so it's generally a lot heavier trigger pull. So you have to fight it down, and then it releases. But you can fire the gun either way. And then that leads into our other main question for this video. Why would you like a gun like this over other kinds of guns. And there are tons of other kinds of guns and other platforms that are out there. For our purposes here, we will consider some specific types of handguns, and we're going to group long guns kind of in their own category. And we'll tackle the long guns first. And there are lots of different kinds of long guns. There are shotguns, there are rifles, there are lever action guns, pistol caliber carbines. There are tons of different guns that fit into the category of being a long gun. And by long gun, I basically mean something that you can get a third point of contact on. You can shoulder it, wear it on, have a brace attachment for your arm, do a cheek well thing with some of them. But something where you can get a third point of contact that helps increase the accuracy. Those guns are really great in that they tend to be more accurate. Almost any kind of long gun is going to be more accurate than something like this. And the main reason for that is that with a gun like this, when you're gripping it, you don't have a whole lot of control. Your arms are very flexible platforms, and you don't have any way to stabilize it aside from your arms. And because of that, handguns in general, whether there's of this specific type or not, it could be revolver or just about anything else. If it's a handgun, generally speaking, you're not going to be overly accurate at any great range with them. Handguns, as far as the mechanics of the gun itself, can actually shoot decently long distances, but the problem is that given that you have to be the one behind it holding it, how steady you can hold it, how much control and discipline you have in being able to fire it, is going to affect the functional accuracy, how far you can actually hit with it, quite a bit. And so the gun mechanically, if you were to lock it up in a vise and have a little machine pull the trigger for you, they could shoot pretty far, pretty accurately. You know, easily in excess of 100 yards if you had a good setup for it. But with a human being behind the trigger, handguns do not usually have a very great effective range. In the hands of the average person, once you get past about 15 yards, that's usually about the limit for most people, practically speaking, just because most people don't practice very much. And under stressful situations, self-defense situations, there tends to be quite a bit of panic going on, and people shake and do all kinds of things like that, and it really cuts into the functional accuracy such that past 15 yards under those kinds of conditions, very stressful conditions, is very difficult for a lot of people. It takes a lot of time and training to get past that, and you can, but functionally it's very rare in self-defensive encounters for successful shots to be fired by low-skill people at more than 15 yards. Very rare. It does happen sometimes, but fairly rare. You get to someone who has a little bit more skill, not just the occasional shooter who shoots maybe 3 times a year, but someone who goes out fairly often, you know, every 2 weeks, maybe every 3 weeks, on a somewhat regular basis, and the functional accuracy can be extended a bit, sometimes out to 25 yards. But they're not any great range guns at all. And you talk about like maybe a competitive shooter, exhibition shooter, those kinds of people, they can often extend the range out to 50 yards and oftentimes beyond if the target is large enough, which is one of the great secrets of accurate shooting. Get a big enough target and you can hit it. But as far as what would be effective in a gunfight, people who are able to function at 50 yards and beyond are usually professional shooters. They put literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of rounds through their gun every year. And most of us do not have the time or the money, because frankly ammo is expensive, most of us do not have the time or the money to become that proficient, so most of us are not going to get up to that level. The average Joe, especially the average Joe who only goes out maybe 2 or 3 times a year to shoot, 15 yards is usually about the max that you can go. And so when it comes to all those long guns that I mentioned, their advantage is that they can work at those longer ranges. Even relatively underpowered long guns like pistol caliber carbines and a lot of the lever action guns, which are considered to be at the low end of the power spectrum, they will still be more effective than your average handgun, just because they can be aimed more efficiently and they can be controlled because you have an extra point of contact. The more points of contact that you have on the gun, the more stable it is going to be when you shoot it. and that makes a huge difference. Okay, and this is one of the reasons why I recommend that people, for their home defense gun, they pick a long gun of some sort, because you're going to tend to be more accurate with it. Even if it isn't overly powerful, something that you can shoulder and aim is going to do you a whole lot more good than a handgun. And also the long guns, on average, not in every single case, but on average, they tend to be more powerful than handguns. Rifles are certainly more powerful, shotguns are more powerful. Even pistol caliber carbines, even though they shoot the exact same rounds as a pistol, that's why they're called pistol caliber carbines, they shoot the exact same rounds, they still tend to be more powerful because the longer barrel length that they have will give it a little bit of added power, and so even they will be more powerful. So they're more accurate and generally more powerful. And in a home defense situation especially, accurate, more powerful, that's a really good thing. So why would someone pick a handgun over those kinds of guns? Simple. A handgun is much more concealable than a long gun is. So if you're talking about something that you're going to carry with you day in and day out throughout your day, and something that isn't going to make people too terribly nervous when they're talking with you, you want something that's going to be relatively inobtrusive. And a small gun like this is much better at that particular goal. Okay, the long guns, the shotguns, the rifles, the lever action guns, the pistol caliber carbines, all of those guns are not overly travel friendly. You know, it's not convenient to get in and out of the car with them or to go grocery shopping with them, etc., etc. Your chances of having those guns on you when you need it is relatively small. They make good home defense guns because in your home you can, set it up, stage it somewhere, and you need to take due precautions if kids are around, of course. But barring having kids around, you can leave it loaded in your house and just simply grab it when you need it. But if you're out and about, long guns are really inconvenient. And so for personal protection when you're out and about on a consistent basis, these are a lot better. Any kind of handgun is going to be a lot better in that regard. Handguns are very portable by comparison and therefore preferable because you will probably have them on you when you don't have the others around. Okay, so that's the first comparison there. Pretty much all long guns, not in every single case, but pretty much all long guns are more accurate and more powerful. But these guns are going to be more concealable, handier, easier to transport and carry. Okay, so those are the pros and cons in that way. And so that compares basically just long guns and pretty much any handgun. What about some of the other kinds of handguns that are out there, like say revolvers, for example? Revolvers are a very common kind of handgun. They just have a little cylinder that holds the bullets in it, and as you pull the trigger, the cylinder spins and sets off the next round. And those are usually very simple to operate, which is great. One of the biggest drawbacks to them, though, is that they don't have a whole lot of capacity. Usually only 5 or 6 shots will fit in the cylinder. There are some that have more, some that have less, but some that have more. But most of the time it's either 5 or 6 shots. Another problem that I personally have with revolvers is that for me, I have a hard time hitting accurately with them. And it's not because of the gun. The gun is actually, in and of itself, fairly accurate. Revolvers have a fixed barrel, whereas these guns generally do not. And I'll go ahead and show that to you. If I open up the gun, you can see that the barrel actually tilts up a little bit relative to the horizontal plane. I'll try to get it so that you can see that tilt on the barrel pretty aggressively. These guns have a tilting barrel most of the time, and that is not going to be as accurate as a fixed barrel design. Fixed barrel doesn't float around, and therefore it's going to be more accurate. And revolvers are like that. They have fixed barrels. So the gun itself is very accurate. The problem is me. When I shoot revolvers, like most people when they shoot revolvers, you have to grip a revolver fairly low because the cylinder itself has to be free to spin. And then also, at the front end of that cylinder, there's going to be a side explosion, basically, that happens. There's a little gap between the cylinder and the barrel that the bullet is going to have to jump across. And so the charge of the bullet is going to go off. The bullet itself is going to go down the barrel, and the gases that propel the bullets are going to shoot out after it. And they'll also shoot around that opening between the cylinder and the barrel. It'll come shooting out the side, and that can really hurt you if you're not careful. So revolvers, you have to grip fairly low so that doesn't happen. And if you grip it fairly low, that means that you're going to get a lot of recoil over the top of the gun, basically in line with the barrel. That's where your primary recoil thrust comes from. And for me, that's really hard to control. I do not like it at all, and I tend to be fairly recoil sensitive. We'll talk about that in other videos, but it becomes a problem for me. And so I don't like revolvers because of that. It's not that revolvers are necessarily bad. They're actually technically more accurate than these guns are in and of themselves, but I can't shoot them accurately because of the recoil issues. So for me, it's not a good pick. Then I also mentioned that those kinds of guns, the revolvers, usually only have 5 or 6 rounds in them. This gun right here holds 13 in the magazine, and if I wanted, I could top it off and put 1 in the chamber as well. So I can put 1 in the chamber, 13 in the magazine. This gun can hold 14 rounds total. And this gun is about the same size as a lot of the revolvers are. So I'm, easily more than double what a revolver can hold. And I've never met anyone who's actually been in a real gunfight or seen an interview with someone who's actually been in a real life gunfight, who in the interview or personally told me and said, I really wish I had a gun that held less bullets in it. I've never seen anyone respond that way once. I've heard people say that they wish they had a gun that held more, and I've seen people say that they wish they had a gun that was more powerful, etc., etc., or a gun that shot more accurately, all those kinds of things, but I've never heard them once say that they wish they had a gun that held fewer rounds. Not once. And so the fact that these kinds of guns can hold more rounds, they don't always. There are some of the double action, single action guns out there that will only hold 6 or 7 rounds, which would be pretty comparable to the revolvers. But there are a lot of them that usually do hold more. Sometimes it's by maybe 1 or 2 rounds. Sometimes it's by 3 or 4. Sometimes it's more than double. So they do have a greater capacity. Okay, so those are some of the pros and cons relative to revolvers. Revolvers have a very low capacity, and for some people like me that are recoil sensitive, they can be hard to shoot. But technically, as far as the mechanical accuracy of the gun is, revolvers are technically more accurate, because they have that fixed barrel. And so if you're someone who can control your recoil sensitivity, your own body's reflex as well, revolvers can actually be more useful for you, provided you have a decent set of sights, and we'll talk about that in a future video. Another kind of handgun that is out there besides the revolver is the single-action autoloader. Like I said, this is a double-action, single-action autoloader. There are autoloaders out there that are just single-action, meaning that for them, the hammer always has to be down to fire. And the problem with that is that in order to have the gun in a state that is somewhat ready, of course your hammer has to be all the way down. And like I mentioned before, when the hammer is all the way down, all that you're doing with the trigger is you're just releasing it. Not a whole lot of pressure is required, oftentimes about half of what it would be to bring the hammer down and then let it fall forward. So it's a fairly light trigger pull. And when you're talking about putting this thing in holster, taking it out of the holster, manipulating it, having a fairly light trigger pull becomes a little bit of a liability. People will sometimes accidentally hit that trigger, and the gun goes off when you don't want it to. At the best side, what happens is you have a hole in the side of your house. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that you wind up injuring someone that you did not intend to injure, possibly killing them. That's a really bad thing. So on single action autoloaders, where you have to have the hammer down all the time and the trigger pull is relatively light, what they'll do is they'll include a safety mechanism on the gun so that accidental discharges don't happen. The bad thing about that, though, is that if you actually do need the gun to defend yourself, you draw the gun, you point it, and you shoot, and you shoot, and you shoot, and you shoot, but nothing happens. Why? Because you forgot to take off the safety. That same safety that keeps you from having an accidental discharge, when it comes time to actually use the gun in self-defense, it becomes a major problem because a lot of people forget to take off the safety, especially people who don't shoot very often. They're just not used to it. And if you forget to take off the safety, the gun's not going to do anything. You're going to keep pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling, and that hammer ain't going to come forward. And if the hammer doesn't come forward, that round isn't going off. It's not going to do a thing for you. At that point, you'd be better off throwing the gun at the other guy and running the other direction. But of course, you just gave him a loaded gun, which is stupid. But when it comes to single-action autoloaders, you really have to train yourself to deactivate the safety so that you can fire the gun. And that is something that a lot of people just simply cannot master because they don't train often enough. And so that is the main difference between a single-action autoloader and a double-action autoloader. Double-action autoloader, you can drop the hammer on them. This one has a little drop mechanism on the back side. You can drop the hammer with a round in the chamber, and if you drop it using the mechanism, it won't go off or anything because it stops just short of hitting the firing pin. But you can drop the hammer, and that gives you that really hard, heavy trigger pull, which is not very likely to come off accidentally. So you still have good protection against accidental discharges. But because it's a double-action gun, I can still fire it when it's like that. I can still pull really hard on the trigger, and it will bring the hammer down for me and then release it. So I can still use it to defend myself. Another kind of autoloader that is out there is called the striker-fired gun. The striker-fired gun does not have a hammer at all. Everything is held internal to the slide itself. There's a little striker mechanism inside the gun itself that activates the firing pin, so on and so forth. And they work a lot like the single-action guns do, except there's no hammer. When you load a round into them, they're ready to go. And again, that trigger pull on them is usually a little heavier than on the single-action autoloaders, but it's not super heavy. And accidental discharges happen fairly often just because there's nothing really between you and the loaded gun. It's a loaded gun, it's ready to go off, you pull the trigger, it's going to go off. And on those striker-fired guns, like Glock is, for example, a good example of a striker-fired gun, the trigger is a little heavy, but it's not heavy enough to keep accidents from happening, unfortunately. These guns, though, in double action mode with the hammer forward, their trigger pull is usually pretty heavy. It's usually double what they are in single action, and that helps a lot. And then there's also certain handling techniques that we'll talk about in later videos that even further enhance that. So why might you like this kind of autoloader versus some of the other kinds of autoloaders like single action autoloaders and striker fired autoloaders? It's because with these ones you don't have to worry about the safety, taking off the safety, and you also have better protection against an accidental discharge because of that really long, heavy trigger pull when the hammer is forward. All right, and that brings us to the end of our first video. We talked about what a single action, double action autoloader is, and then we also discussed some of the other guns and how they stack up to them. Long guns are great, they're more powerful, and they're more accurate, but they're not exactly convenient to carry around all the time. If you're looking for something that you can use to defend yourself at any time of day, they don't work out that well. They make good home defense guns, but they're not really conducive to carrying around the grocery store. Let's just be honest. And then as far as other kinds of handguns are concerned, revolvers are nice and simple, but they don't hold many rounds. They can be hard to fire for some people as far as firing them accurately, and so that's a little bit of a problem. When it comes to other kinds of autoloaders, like the single action ones and the striker fired ones, accidental discharges with those ones are unfortunately fairly common. And it's because the triggers on them are relatively easy to set off, and that creates quite a bit of liability. The advantage of this kind of a gun is that when the hammer is forward, you have a very long, heavy trigger pull that prevents you from accidentally setting the trigger off. But it's still a trigger pull. You can still get the gun to go off that way, so in a moments where you might need to defend yourself, you can still bring it to bear and actually get a successful shot off. It's a good balance of the needs of all the other guns. More capacity than a revolver, harder to set off than a striker-fired gun or a single-action autoloader. You don't have to worry about taking off the safety if you leave it in double-action mode. Lots of really good things going for it. But it has weaknesses. It's not as accurate or as powerful as a long gun. It's also not as accurate as a revolver or as simple as a revolver. And then relative to the single-action autoloader, Again, this one is more complicated than that other platform. There's a lot more buttons on these guns than there are in single-action autoloaders. And the same thing for striker-fired guns. Striker-fired guns are very, very simple. It's basically rack around, and then you're ready to go. And that's pretty much all that you have to remember about them. There's not a whole lot to operating them. So those ones do tend to be simpler. In terms of controls, these are actually probably one of the worst. There's lots of controls on these guns and lots of things to get used to. But a lot handier to carry around than a long gun, greater capacity than a revolver, and once you get used to the controls, a greater degree of safety than with striker-fired guns, and you don't have to worry about deactivating a safety like on single-action autoloaders. All right, that's the summary. Thank you very much for your time. Next time we'll go over some of the basic safety rules that will help keep you safe in using this gun or pretty much any other gun. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Bye.